I know it's going to be a busy sort of day four, welcome day four APAP. We're kind of in the final stretch here, so we'll get started just so that we can get everybody off and moving into their day. I'm sure schedules are still really, really packed and things are happening. So just to make sure y'all are in the right place, this is Responsible Innovation, Digital Trust, and the Performing Arts. And super excited to be in conversation with our panelists here today and with you all. I'm Chisa Yamaguchi. I'm Senior Manager with Sozo. I'm also one of your APAP committee co-chairs. So I hope the conference has been really fruitful for you all and excited to hear more from you when the surveys come out, certainly as we keep evolving and growing and just getting better at all of this. So I won't be doing a lot of talking. I'll be helping sort of moderate the conversation, but certainly going to be leaning on you all as a community as well for questions that feel really relevant to what you're dealing with and facing with around this particular topic. We've got these incredible panelists, so I'll just sort of give them the floor to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll just get right into it. How's that sound?
Sure.
Please, so if you don't mind kicking us off.
Sure. Hi, Scott Sholder. I'm an attorney at Cowan, DeBaets, Abrahams, and Sheppard. We are a boutique law firm located due south, all the way down in the financial district. We handle entertainment and media matters. Those are our core industries: arts, entertainment, kind of all the disciplines you can think of: television, film, publishing, performing arts, photography, et cetera, et cetera. I'm the co-chair of the litigation practice there. So my practice focuses mainly on copyright and trademark litigation and business disputes that arise in entertainment and media. We do defamation defense and First Amendment, pre-publication kind of reviews, pre-broadcast reviews, and when things go south with programming, they'll come to us for defense if there are defamation claims, infringement claims. We're on both sides of a lot of issues. One of the issues that we're focused on now, very squarely on the plaintiff side, is copyright infringement cases against AI companies for stealing all of the stuff, for using. Sorry, I shouldn't use such loaded language. There are copyright infringement matters for the copying and reproduction used for trading of mostly books at this point. We're on the book cases. So that's been fun and interesting and is keeping us busy.
Hi, my name is Zachariah. I'm a lawyer as well. I started my foray into legal practice with arts as the backdrop when I joined the National Endowment for the Arts and was in-house counsel there. And I spent a number of years there, mostly doing grant making, as it's a grant making agency. So that was really my first exposure to practicing in the art space in the sector. And after that, I moved on to be the general counsel and executive vice president at the Kennedy Center. I was there for a number of years, and so really got a great taste of performing arts and that sort of element of the field and how that works and all of the legal ramifications and board governance and operations of what was at one point a robust performing arts center. And now I'm chief legal officer at Amalgamated Foundation, which is a fiscal intermediary. So it's great to be here.
Yeah, awesome. My name is Christos, Makridis, and thank you for Chisa for moderating this. This is a great kind of conversation for us to have, especially at this moment in time. My doctorates are in economics and engineering and have come from like a very, very different field, but one that I feel is thematically very similar because as a professor, as a researcher, I tried to make art with my words and through what I write. And so I'm an associate professor at Arizona State University and digital fellow at Stanford University's Digital Economy Lab, and then kind of more close to the themes in APAP, I also serve and lead in something called Living Opera Foundation and Living Opera Media. Our focus is on producing classical multimedia work and then finding ways to grow the sector through different business models, as well as just reaching people that normally wouldn't have thought of themselves as maybe classical enthusiasts or just kind of art enthusiasts. And so as somebody that didn't grow up really engaging with art as a child, I'd be kind of like the last person you'd think you look and you say, oh, this person's a STEM person and just doing engineering. But then hearing beautiful sound, beautiful voices, that really brought me into the sphere. So really delighted to be here today. And yeah. looking forward to the conversation.
Hi, I'm Denise Zubizarreta. I'm a mixed media interdisciplinary artist. I'm the Director of Business Development and Communications at the New Mexico Local News Fund. I am also the Director of Engagement and Senior Editor for Latina Media Co. I write in arts and culture, journalism, and critique in film and media. I will be at Sundance if any of you are there. Please come and hang out. And I work in multiple mediums as an artist myself. So I'm kind of stuck in the argument per my own wonderful, joyous exploration of visual art making. But I also I'm a PhD student right now at Dominican University in applied social justice. So my focus is always on what AI and technology is doing into the arts and culture sector. I also have a certificate in cybersecurity, and so I do come at it from multiple angles. So I'm excited.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So I know there's going to be a lot that we're going to be unpacking. And so I think I'll just start by grounding us as we were sort of doing an intro call right after the holidays, which feels like forever ago. I know the first thing that we had really started to discuss was trust. And in an era of AI-generated content and this digital abundance, what does trust mean for performing arts organizations, artists, and audiences? I know that's a massive question, but how can trust be intentionally built and sustained across live performance and digital documentation and marketing, even if it's over time?
Where do you want to start?
Anywhere.
Oh,
Who's going to first taker?
it is a loaded question, right? And I think from my standpoint, right, in applied social justice and that thought process, trust comes from equity and engagement, right? And so if we're not having conversations, especially with AI and digital trust, about the equity within AI or those conversations at all, if we're not represented in the conversation, then no real trust can be built. People are still building these things, and I think that's part of what we kind of lose focus on a lot of the time, right? This is still human made, this is still human building, it's going to have flaws, it's going to have implicit bias, unconscious bias, right? And what does that mean? So if we really want to start, I think, on a foundational standpoint in a trust conversation, we always have to start there, right? And where does this fall within an equity standpoint?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Can I add to this? That sometimes the conversation about trust in AI, we focus on the technology, but trust as kind of a concept is just, it obviously predates, I mean, it's kind of beginning of human history. And so within the arts, one of the ways that you build trust is just by treating people the way that you would like to be treated. And so that obviously has manifestations when you're building an AI system. For example, if you're training a classifier, you need to train it on representative data. But even before you kind of get to that stage of like a sophisticated algorithm, trust is built from within the artistic community by treating each other with respect. And so there's certain things that might be inconsistent with that. During the pandemic, many artists were terminated without ever, not paid their contracts and then terminated just via a press release. And so that's something that does cause a deterioration in trust. And then there's other things that build trust when you remunerate people what they're worth. And obviously there can be debates about what the salary should be and how much the contract should be. And I don't mean to get into those details, but and then of course with Gen AI there are, and this is something that will certainly come up a lot over the conversation, when you take property rights without kind of giving somebody what they contributed, taking somebody's voice, that is something that can cause a deterioration of trust or elimination of trust. And so I think we're really at this inflection point where we sometimes treat it as a technology issue when really it's like these foundational human elements of just, is that the way that you'd like to be treated? If not, then think twice about what you're going with.
I think in response,
I was waiting to see if you had anything.
I just had something really quick to add, which is, to speak on the foundational element of what trust is and really simplifying it in the sense that, when we want to protect our artists, we want to make sure that our audiences feel like what they are seeing is authentic. We want artists to feel that they are safe in what they are putting out there, because at the end of the day, the product is deeply it's different than a lot of other sort of sectors in that the product is deeply personal, and there are many ways in which to experience the art. So the underlying trust of audiences and the art really, in so many ways, is rooted in this idea of transparency of the mediums that we're using, why we're using them, how we're using them. And the question of who made this now versus when we asked that question 5 years, 10 years, 15 years ago, it's very different. Like in my mind, when I sort of look at a piece of art and I think who made this, now I start to also think about, was this human made? And that was not necessarily a question that we used to think about when we asked who made this. And so transparency also, I think, is becoming even more important in really solidifying that root of trust that is really the basis of how audiences enjoy the art, how artists make the art.
Yeah, so I had written down a few kind of like key categories that I think form the basis of what we can call trust in this context, and transparency is at the top of the list. Transparency in how work is created, where, especially we're talking about generative AI, what source material was used, were the creators of the source material compensated. Part of transparency also was labeling. There's certainly a school of thought that AI-generated content should be labeled as such, with some sort of watermark, or, especially when we're talking about, this gets a little further afield into issues not necessarily relevant here, but deepfakes and political ads and things that can really have significant societal change. Certainly should be labeled, but even artwork and videos and things that you see online, I think labeling is important. And then for me, especially in the context of these copyright infringement lawsuits, licensing and compensation should be a key component of building trust. If people's content is being used without permission or without compensation, there's literally no basis for trust. And part of, and again, linked to that is the concept of agency. People should have the choice of whether their content is used in certain platforms. Whether that's practically possible or technologically possible is a subject of debate and has been for a couple of years. Opting out versus opting in of certain platforms. Most of the major companies have already scraped the entire internet and taken anything that was pre-existing anyway, so it's kind of hard to opt out at this point. But then that circles back to compensation. People should be paid when their content is used without permission. So all that, I think, at least from a legal standpoint, forms kind of a foundation for trust.
Well, one thing I was going to jump in and just add before we kind of move on from this is that at a federal level, at a policy level, there have been some executive orders over the past, let's say, 7 years that have been around identifying principles of what is like a trustworthy AI system. Most of these were developed pre-Gen AI, but they hit on these themes. So I think there's like either 7 or 9. And so you've got transparency, you've got accountability, understandability. So do you understand the way that the system works? So for those that kind of want additional material on that, that's been a big subject of debate. There's also, within the concept of fairness, in statistics, there's different definitions of what is fairness. There's something called demographic parity, or there's something called equalized odds. And so it's just to say that I think at a human level, we have a sense of when something's wrong, but yeah, it can get, once you start unpacking it and taking it to practice, like the principle, but then how do you operationalize it in practice, it can get kind of tricky.
Yeah, I think it also gets muddy in the sense of how do we as the general public have trust in systems that are already gatekept, that are designed to be exploitative, right? And so if this is the core fundamental of how these businesses run without any other thought process behind them, right? We're not really going to get into a conversation about trust, right? We can try to legally define it and we can put some barriers around it, but ultimately at the end of the day, the system is going to system, right? It is going to continue to figure out a way to monopolize and commodify and just continue to just bank in on the bottom line because it is bottom line driven. And we're seeing that, especially right now, I think with the AI actress, right? And Christos and I got into a conversation about this too earlier, and what does that even mean? Right? And what do we really mean by trust, right? You've now designed an AI actress that has no real culture, right? And she's essentially commodified to a perfect extension to be the ideal person to view, right? She has no ethnicity, there's no culture in it. But then what does that mean when a digital product is then mimicking culture and mimicking humanity? And as a bottom line driven industry, especially within film, right, and television, if I don't have to pay an actor to be insured or to do any of these things, we get into a much larger conversation for the human actors who are now being asked within contractual, spaces to sell their likeness, right? And where does that trust boundary go, right? What are you now able to sell to the masses with my likeness that doesn't really truly include my permission, because I've had to now sell it over to you and you've been able to manipulate my humanity in a digital way. So I think trust goes a lot deeper.
Oh my gosh, there's so much here around like protecting creative rights in practice and governance and ethics certainly are all coming up. And there's just so much that's been floating around and will continue to. And I really appreciate that idea that the systems are systeming with or without us, and maybe mostly without us. And it's been interesting to be in conversation where it feels like these are just happening and we're sort of racing to participate, to understand while the systems are constantly, relentlessly changing. And really curious in terms of what we're talking about trust as well, but specifically in the arts and these incredible, unique, I'm going to say diverse, because that is so true, right? These incredible communities around the United States, but also around the world, this idea of cultural fluency and potentially just sort of speaking to that in terms of some of these systems, because like you said, they're human made. And so they're not going to be without their biases, that if we were just designing systems for here in the United States, they might be about like immediate reward and urgency and immediacy in a way that maybe some other cultures around the world are more about process and time and development. And so to impart a singular system on a global scale certainly is not taking that cultural fluency in mind, whereas we see all these venues programming specific to these communities. And I'm wanting to see where sort of, if you could speak to that gap a little bit, and maybe even if there's some successful examples of where there has been integration that has spoken to more a bespoke level that way within this sort of world of system, human and systems.
There is a new AI that was built by a friend of mine that is called Justice AI, right? And so what he tried to do was program out the bias, right? We were seeing a lot of generative AI that wasn't exemplary of any cultural bandwidth, right? But as I had a conversation with him about it, through my own frameworks that I'm working on in my dissertation, right? Something that I call colonial Stockholm syndrome, right? That we're probably, the majority of us are existing in within the United States' kind of cultural stamp. How do you know that even if you are trying to remove the bias, that you don't also have some kind of bias, right? That even within you, even being culturally open or being of mixed race, right? How do you know that you're also not programming in certain systematic inefficiencies, but intentional inefficiencies? And I'm like, and if you come from a colonial Stockholm syndrome or a colonial impositional framework already mentally, all of that is going to just be amplified, right? So I don't know if we can really program out all of the biases. I don't think that exists. And I think to think in the mindset that it could exist without implicit bias is kind of naive, I think, especially right now. And we're seeing not only that generative AI is being used, forget about writing, but also to create visual propaganda. And then we're living in a state where media literacy and visual literacy just barely exist in general, right? And so how do we have the conversation about a government that can legislate implicit bias when the government itself is implicitly biased? It makes no sense, right? We're just gonna spin in a circle and we're not gonna find anything, but it's moving too quickly for us. We can't put the pause on it. We can't slow it down. We can only try to keep up or try to kind of put barricades around it. But if all of the barricades are flawed, are they really barricades? Sorry. No. Welcome to PhD Brain. Today at noon. No.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big structure, like, so part of what Denise is talking about is like the underlying infrastructure. There's certain incentives that have been built into the system. And so if you kind of peel back the onion of AI systems, so the frontier labs, so you think OpenAI, Anthropic, Mistral, Google, et cetera, we'll peel back the onion a little bit more. What preceded that? So then there was a Web 2 revolution. You have Meta, you have, well, and then Instagram got integrated into Meta and Google, et cetera, and peel back the onion some more. Then you have with Web 1, that was the advent of the internet. And so it was at that critical time that we had an opportunity to maybe create the right incentives, and they weren't really created that well, because I don't think anyone ever anticipated the internet to blow up in the way that it had. And so the internet was originally designed to be more of like a write and store, and then we would access things. So there would be people that are kind of like just reading information on a website. And so now that we create digital footprints online, and then these companies, Google, et cetera, Meta, et cetera, they take those digital footprints and then they sell that and create ad revenue. That is their business model. So in one sense, we are the product. And so this conversation that we're having now about trust, it's complicated, as Denise mentioned, because we're entering it at a point in time where the genie has kind of been let out. And so I think the hopeful part about this is that, yes, it's challenging. Yes, there are structural challenges that we need to work through, but that, like, thinking about each of our roles within this broader enterprise, what small steps can we individually take? So if you're in law, then it's about you write contracts that demonstrate respect and that lift people up, and then you try to form coalitions and you try to influence the legislative process. And I think the kind of call to action is, where do we individually stand where we can make kind of a difference and a force for good there. So it's a challenging, boulder to push up the hill, but at the same time, there's agency that we individually have, whatever our perch is.
I'm kind of curious though, for Scott and Asha, right? In the contract side of the law, is cybersecurity being included in this process, right? And I find that cybersecurity tends to be like the last thing ever discussed, right? But when all your data is leaked, you'll know, right? And so is that part of these contractual conversations? Are we planning in already the fail, right? And the loss of all that data?
The short answer is yes. I mean, at least in my experience. I have some, as much as, like 90% of my practice is litigation, I do some transactional work and have been advising clients on licensing AI content, AI-generated content, when I have some clients that will license in content from, authors or other creators, and then license it and then have the right to license it out for AI training use, and then some have their own content that they're licensing to be used in the models. And yeah, there are, we've at least built in safety protocols and standards for cybersecurity, what happens in the event of a breach. There's got to be insurance coverage. There's got to be indemnification, reps and warranties about, what level of security that the AI platform has, reporting of breaches, like if something goes wrong, can't just kind of like sweep it under the rug and just pretend it didn't happen. Like, no, it has to be reported. We have to know about it. We have to know what steps you're taking. All this is completely new, right? We have to kind of make this, we're building the plane in the air. Because these kinds of provisions don't really exist. They exist in some form or another in other areas of technology, and so you can adapt them. But by and large, there's no real template to go by. So we're just kind of starting from scratch. But given that there's been data breaches before, even from the big AI companies, yeah, you've got to have provisions for that.
Yeah, and you know, when technology is moving this quickly, it is up to us to sort of write the playbook because regulations are always going to lag, and often those regs will be informed by what we do now and how we put the guardrails on cybersecurity, on processes, on how boards at organizations are really starting to think about AI and this as another governance domain for the organization and how that will work. So outside of the contract and all the checks and balances that Scott had mentioned, it is also this broader idea of framing out the governance model for AI, making sure that boards are educated on the ways in which technology is moving and how to be as anticipatory as possible, because ultimately, all of us will be the folks that kind of come in to help regulatory bodies start to put their framing together. They will be behind, but at least there will be some sort of playbook that we can draw from.
This is so fascinating. I'm taking all the notes along with all of you. And as we're sort of thinking about this, because certainly grounding again in the, with the performing arts being so centered here at this conference and being in New York City and feeling, as you're saying, this technology is just racing. It's just going. And certainly we're all in these conversations about artistic risk taking. And as these technologies are sort of permeating everywhere, understanding more about the ethics of this, as we are putting more, scripts and books and choreography and voiceovers and all of this stuff is like in the ether and it just kind of pours out, right, of the artists, and it's certainly drawing a lot of these presenters and buyers to bring these experiences. I'm also really curious about examples of responsible innovation that really has strengthened creative process and expanded access or deepened audience engagement without compromising the artistic integrity or even hindering the artistic risk-taking that is just inherent in what a lot of our practices, even if we're just buyers. I think even as audiences, it feels like a risk to go to see and participate in some of these things. And certainly like an AI sort of prompted experience, maybe a little bit more hesitant still, but I'm just super curious about some maybe responsible innovative examples.
I think the gallery systems breach, I know it sounds horrible because it was a breach, but it's also very responsible, right? Most citizens of the United States don't realize that the US government owns a boatload of art, right? In multiple mediums. And the major galleries and museums were all using gallery systems, which is also a problem, right? But it's not that there's a monopolization of storing all of this data, right? It's that nobody really thought about it, and most of the larger players have their own internal systems, right? And so gallery systems was storing everything, right? The locations of priceless works of art, films that also have been blacklisted. By the way, there's only one film that's ever been blacklisted by the US government. You should see it, it's amazing. And there's a lot of things that are owned in that space that Gallery Systems was holding the locations for. So when Gallery Systems was breached, not only was watching the breach fascinating, but also frightening, right? Because all of this money is now sitting in the hands of a data leak, right? And then the US government's investment opportunities, you're watching just things start to tank in the process. But what was fascinating about it and why it's responsible is that Gallery Systems immediately called it out. And they were like, we failed. We got hacked. All of you should not be putting your eggs in this one basket, right? You need to diversify this space. And so I thought it was fascinating for the company itself to go, please go find someone else to do this, right? Can we please diversify the space? And if you don't want to diversify the space, bring in your own in-house cybersecurity teams. Here's how to kind of bridge this process. And I just found it fascinating that they were really so transparent about it and really giving practical solutions that the system can innovate from. So I thought that was kind of cool.
So a quick story with some data that kind of tells this message as well is I have a project with a friend named Tim Liu at University of Utah, and we take all the Fortune 500 companies and we measure. So we work with a company called Rapid7 that scans the networks of publicly traded companies, and we identify different vulnerabilities on these companies' networks, and we link that with asset pricing data. So think stock returns on a month-to-month basis, and what we find is that the average, or actually the median publicly traded company in this Fortune 500 is losing about $90 million of value every year. And so sort of what Denise said is like, if you just kind of came up front and said, we have an issue, we're going to deal with it, we actually need some help dealing with it, you would save or generate more long-term value and just kind of suck it up in the short run. But what ends up happening with a lot of companies, including publicly traded companies, which by the way, their concern isn't, it's not like a lack of liquidity. They have access to public markets. So it's not that they don't have enough money. It's usually kind of the incentives that they have to signal at a particular moment of time and worrying about the stock price. But if they just said, we've got a problem, we're going to do something about it. And so this example that Denise shared is a good instance where, hey, it's maybe a little bit more challenging in the short run, but we're going to save ourselves a lot in the long term because we're actually moving towards solving a problem. So it just requires, good leadership, bold leadership to be willing to do that.
And from a copyright standpoint, there are companies that kind of from the start have pushed back on the kind of mass scraping of content and use by the image generating AI platforms of copyrighted material without permission. Getty Images was the first company to file a lawsuit, class action lawsuit. The first one was in the UK, and then there was one here for copyright infringement. They only were willing to engage in AI with licensed content. And so now they have some partnerships and they have their own AI generation system using licensed content to make sure that creators are compensated. Same thing with Adobe and their Firefly product. Shutterstock had another one as well. From my kind of sometimes hyper-focused legal view on the copyright side of things, responsible AI development, product development, and output is centered around licensing and permissions. Say what you will about how much each person is getting paid. Those systems are not perfect. We saw that with music streaming services. To this day, musicians are not thrilled with what they're getting paid from streaming services like Spotify and YouTube Music and Apple and Tidal. But we have to take the system that we have and use it, and people getting paid is better than people not getting paid. Hopefully something better comes up, but these are similar systems where it's a type of a blanket license where someone gets a percentage, and now there's technology that can kind of back into what source material was used in a particular piece of output. I don't think it's totally mainstream yet, but that kind of crediting and attribution is going to lead to a lot more transparency, like we talked about before, and compensation, and hopefully higher levels of compensation.
Yeah, and I'll add just from a contractual perspective with when we were working with talent a lot, we would try to make sure that, a lot of times these standard talent contracts are the licensing clauses are where the organization will just take a broad license in perpetuity for, whatever the artist has provided for the organization. And we started to make a more intentional effort to curate these licenses so that we weren't really making the artist, especially depending on sort of the place they were coming from a negotiation standpoint, making the artist provide a large scope license, and rather it was oftentimes a time-bound license. What does the organization need to use from the artist in this sort of contract that both parties have come together on? How long should it be used for? And, trying to curate that in a more intentional and meaningful way, I think, is a simple thing to try to innovate. And one of the other things that we started to add to a lot of our licensing agreements was to make sure that name, image, and likeness were also licensed, and in some cases voice as well. So you're really starting to make sure that an artist is providing a license that is exactly what the organization might need, not over-inclusive, not over-expansive. And for us, that just really protected the artist. So trying to curate those clauses a little bit more, I think, is also helpful.
I want to add, so I want to like really affirm that, because that's a very tangible thing that performing arts institutions can do that sort of costs you nothing, because sometimes you have like this overly general clause that ends up hurting the artists and discouraging them, because maybe a label is just like sitting, a theater label, whoever it might be, is sitting on this intellectual property that they're not going to activate. And so in the absence of them using it, the artist is like, what's going on? Why you're not doing anything? Why can't I do something? And this happened really recently for a friend with one of the big labels where their IP they're just sitting on. They're not going to release the album. They're just going to sit in on it, but she can't do anything with it. So I think this is Asha made a really good point that this is just like low hanging fruit. You don't need to invent some new system. Just really scrutinize the terms of your conditions. By the way, this also happens all the time in HR. Job postings that go out, you just like use the same job posting that existed before. But what if you need to like do an inventory? What do we need to deliver excellence to our audience, and then work backwards from that? And so sometimes you maybe need to touch up a clause that you had on the books and kind of modernize it. So kind of a call towards redoing those inventories in today's era.
It's my face, right? Okay. I always end up back at the same spot, right? And we can put all of the clauses in, right? But for instance, right, Donald Trump released a considerable amount of generated AI images. One where he's a Jedi, and by the way, if you are a nerd like me, you knew what the lightsaber meant. We were all there, okay? And now, even if we put these contractual things in place, even if we protect the artists who the AI is pulling all of this visual data and visual literacy from, we still don't have their permission to generate propaganda. We still don't have their permission to generate an image that goes against what their pure beliefs are, right? So we're saying that what we are commodifying is the essence of art, the idea of style, right? And what does that even mean? When we can all blend in, especially I think within the visual arts, we kind of all blend in certain sectors, right? That's why there's mixed media artists. That's why people work in digital and paint, right? But even if you license and you put all these laws into place, you still are able to generate imagery and content that can directly go against the artist's belief, but will ever be associated with the artist because you stole their PI, right? That is their personal, identifiable thought process, right? That is their style, it's their stamp that will now forever be associated in these places. So when we talk about the contractual back end, are we also having that conversation for the artist to be able to come out and go, I didn't sign up for this?
Yeah, or at least like, how do you enforce that? And
Right.
yeah, because I mean, that happened. One of the Frontier Labs took Scarlett Johansson's voice, and I mean, then that became a very public thing. So I think, how do you create like norms and standards around enforcement around this? And that's where I think in performing arts, it's like we can take a stance to just say like we're going to respect the artists. We're not going to do something like that. There might be other companies, other sectors where they're a little bit more laissez-faire with how they use that IP. But I think, yeah, individually we can take a stance there.
But
Scott?
can you though, even though it's like multiple artists at once being pulled for one generative image?
So I can go into some of that stuff,
Yes,
legally,
please.
but I don't want to I don't know if I'm hijacking the agenda here. Like if there's stuff you want to cover. I don't know.
we're totally well. It's interesting, right? Because I've been so curious about like where artists are co-designers of these value structures, and maybe being contemplative around AI for good. What does that mean, right? I don't know how to answer that, but I've been really curious about that. Just through the benefit of working with a couple of artists in the AI space and really being at the forefront of seeing their artistic minds, they're like, I'm going to learn to code and I'm going to learn to build this system because I know my own artistic practice being infused in here is not because it's replacing something, but it's in dialogue with all these other systems that are being AI generated. And I also think it's an interesting space, especially coming from a deep sort of embodied dance practice. I have elders. Who are our elders in the AI space? Like what is our lineage as we're speaking on, we're building the plane as we're flying it. And a lot of us are hella good at that, right? Like, especially in the arts, we find ourselves in that practice a lot, even if it's defined in all these different genres. But then I also am curious as, we're building contract clauses as things are happening now. And is there something that is both responsive or innovative as opposed to reactive to this space? And again, where do artists help co-design as things are moving this quickly? I know these are bigger questions, but I feel like I'm asking myself all the time as I'm seeing some of these new things popping up.
The problem, legally, the problem is that a lot of this is going to be reactive because, as we were talking about before, the laws and regulations lag behind technology all the time. When you're talking about an artist's voice, their persona, the thing they infuse into anything, whether it's a performance or a painting or a poem or whatever, that style is not protected by copyright. So there's a limitation on how reactive you can be when something is output that is similar to your work. The style, genre, format, structure, things like that, not protectable. The expression of those styles, those ideas, they're essentially the same as ideas, and you can't copyright an idea. So it gets tricky when you have output that looks or sounds like your work. It's in your voice. Maybe it looks like you, or it mimics a performance that you gave. There are standards that have to be met in order to be able to validly react to that in a legal way, at least from a copyright standpoint. But from a voice standpoint, and having something that comes out that goes directly against the ethos of the artist, that's even more difficult because you can't, especially when it comes to public performance. If there have been a number of cases where a politician that is not to the liking of a particular artist will use a song at a rally, or a song at an inauguration event or something like that, and the artist says, "Whoa, I didn't give you permission to do that. I don't agree with your politics, so stop doing it." From a copyright standpoint, as long as the venue that's playing the song has the public performance license, you're out of luck. So you have to resort to things like trademark law and unfair competition and name, image, likeness kind of concepts to say, you're making it seem like I endorse you. It's not you can't use my work. It's the message you're conveying is incorrect. And this gets even more complicated when it's AI generated content. There are all kinds of copyright issues that go along with that, but it's so much easier to create a situation like that as opposed to a rally where you have to organize it and get the licenses and get the PA system and draw the people and play the music. The president puts out stuff all the time that indicates, that includes things like, Star Wars references, and sure, I doubt George Lucas appreciates that, but it's just so much easier to do it now. And so you kind of have to be reactive. There's not much you can do contractually about that. Even when the licensing structures are put in place, people have to abide by the licensing structure, and that's why I am hopeful that AI won't take my job, because that's what people hire me for, is to be reactive and go after the people who ignore the licenses and things like that. I don't know that necessarily answered much of your question.
It did for me. I was very excited. But then I wonder, so it's something that you said, right? Can the artists really co-design in this system? And my thoughts here are, what are you really giving away in perpetuity? Because the internet is forever, right? So can you really co-design? Can that be a living, breathing, continuous process? I don't know. And are we really talking about innovation, or are we being led to submit, to continue the systematic commodification of the artist, to continue to now be submissive in the thing that we've been fighting for as artists forever? This level of independency, this level of autonomy, this level of just pure creativity, and this is mine, and this is where I exist in this space. And if you now start to play in this space with AI, like we see with Tilly Norwood, right, the AI actress, right, where her designer has said that she's an artist and all she's trying to do is experiment, right? Which is the same argument that photographers had at the beginning of photography, right? Photography was seen as such a horrible innovation, and it wasn't for like 50 years until after photography came out that we really started having deeper conversations about the art form. But what does she really give now in perpetuity, right? What did you give now to this existing artificial intelligence that will only continue to grow and spread and then eventually exist within its own frame, right? Without your input, right? It will continue to generate itself, right? So what does the artist really have to be able to be safe in that space? I don't really know. But those are the things that kind of concern me. Are we just being led to continue to submit to a system that has been nothing but extractive, right, for the artist, especially within the performing arts? And what are we asking of performers now to give up in perpetuity?
Yeah, maybe two thoughts on this, because it's this kind of conversation that the artists and producers, the theater companies, whoever it might be, the institutions, have to be in conversation over. So many times there's this kind of wall that's set up where there's this extra formality, and I think this concept of co-design is really up to the players to talk about it. And I think this is one of the big arbitrage opportunities for the arts, is to bring the artists more in, or the artists taking more of an entrepreneurial stand. And you see sometimes, you see like a Snoop Dogg or Beyonce that set up their own big companies, but even at a more micro level, we can think about, artists can think about how to do this. But it really does, it's tricky, because on one hand you've got if you kind of go the big label route, oftentimes they will use you, and so you have to go, if you do go with like a big label, you have to think about that. And then institutions have to be very weary of not abusing their bargaining power and take advantage of it, especially because in the arts there is a lot of financial precarity, and so artists are in sometimes a very vulnerable position, so we have to be weary of that. But I think it would just be a call towards how do we treat people with that respect, kind of within our ecosystem. And then I'll say a really quick note that this is also a positive thing. So I have a forthcoming paper in the Journal of Cultural Economics where we look at the arts and how exposed they are to generative AI. And then I do a comparison, like different subgroups of the arts, but then also arts to non-arts. And so far it looks like greater exposure to generative AI is leading to slightly higher earnings, not that much earning, not that much of a gain, but it's certainly not having this negative effect on artists. And so will that continue? I mean, maybe there's different opinions about this. Maybe it'll kind of reverse. But it looks so far like there's this positive, or at least not negative, effect that's happening. And then among artists that are using generative AI, they're using it to learn new things, consolidate information, automate more basic tasks. And so it seems like it's playing this augmentation role. But again, with the caveat that we need to be very careful stewards of how it continues to unravel.
One of the problems with this concept of kind of co-creation, co-authorship, whatever you want to call it, conceptually it's great. In practice, at least from a legal standpoint, if artists care about this, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, that raw output from prompts is not copyrightable. So you go on to Midjourney or Sora or whatever, and you say, make me a picture of this, make me a video of that, make me a song that sounds like Taylor Swift. That machine-generated output is not owned by anybody. Once you start changing it and adding human elements to it, the human-added elements are potentially protectable if they rise to the level of copyrightability, which is a low bar, but, photoshopping something, changing the colors, adjusting things here and there is not going to be enough. So there's ongoing litigation about this. There's controversy at the Copyright Office. There's stuff going on in federal courts. So you also have to figure out, like, and if you're going to try to protect an artist as a co-creator or a contributor to something that is generated through an AI platform, tracking what was human created and what wasn't, so you know what you can protect and monetize. You can monetize things that aren't copyrighted, but it's harder to get a good licensing deal when you don't own it. So that's a complicating factor, I think.
I mean, I do want to say to Christos's point, what I heard there was an economic argument, right? An argument in the bottom line of what's happening in the pocket of the artists that are associating. What is also missing is the understanding that we are seeing legitimate cognitive decline in the abuse and use of AI in a consistent basis. What does that cognitive decline mean for creativity, which is the lifeblood of the artist? So cool, there's money in your pocket, but eventually you're gonna burn out because now your brain is just not functioning at the same space, right? It's not gonna produce the same level of thought when you can go to something that's going to constantly generate something for you, right? So if we look at the cognitive decline and the increase in an economic standpoint, again, we go right back to my point. What are we really being asked to do? We are being asked to submit to the machine, right? And I'm not saying that that's a positive. I'm not necessarily saying that it's a negative, but in the land of colonial empire that we are in, and especially in one that is so hell-bent on a consumeristic, individualistic place for us to exist in, right? You are asking the artist to burn themselves out, to give every ounce of energy into this space so that eventually the artist is not needed, right? Because you will feed that AI, you will create that AI's intelligence, which will then be commodified and reproduced in ways that you couldn't have even thought of, right? Through an algorithm, right? And then eventually your cognitive space, your creativity is gone. Right. So I think it's important that if we're going to talk about that, yes, there is a financial benefit, there is also a massive loss on creativity and cognitive space.
Yeah, really quick. I think one of the things that this raises is the displacement versus the augmentation effects of technology, and that technology is there. The question is how we use it. And so there have been, throughout many times in history, there's destructive forms of technology, like you can use social media for good, or it can be highly addictive. And so similar with AI, I think that's why it's incumbent upon us to use it for augmentation-based capabilities for artists, performance managers, whoever we might be, instead of the kind of like the displacement effects. Because as Denise said, there is a version of a dystopian version of the world where we use it as a crutch that helps us in the short run, but then it causes deterioration and it's sort of a race to the bottom. So we want to avoid that race to the bottom and use it in more edifying ways. And so we need to rely on intrinsic motivation to use it well. We need to rely on good incentives and copyright law to the extent that we can. But there really are these two different roads that we can go down, and we have to be very, very careful individually as well as societally.
Yeah, especially because we don't have use cases, right? So this is not like a drug that's been tested by the FDA and that we've gone through all of this testing and understanding of how this is affecting us.
We are the test.
We are the test, right? We are the guinea pigs right now. And so I think that's even more concerning because it's really easy to dive in and get stuck. Right. And I say that as a smoker who has an addiction issue. Okay. Right. Like I'm well aware what the nicotine is doing to me, but now it's too late. Right. And so this is kind of where I see this going. Right. And maybe that's why I see it that way.
Yo, we are grappling. This is so intense, and it is so, I mean, it's just going to be with us forever, or whatever time is in terms of this. But, you know, I think there's a part of me that's always looking for where we can sort of optimistically lean toward the future. And this grappling is a huge part of that, to be totally frank. Like, this being like intentionally reactive feels super important in listening to all of you. And there's such a vigilance that we can't lose the stamina for in a space like this, which, as we've experienced in the world, there's just a chaotic onslaught of so much that I think has naturally, organically led to a lot of apathy, where spaces and systems like this can just take over and fill in the gap when we lose the ability to be present because we are burnt out. And I really appreciated when I was listening to Ocean Vuong last year, just talking about poetry. And he's like, why would I want to read poetry generated by AI? Like, I want to read poetry by a human that has grappled with their life, that has sat in darkness with themselves or triumph. And I need to feel that because there's a depth of affirmation that I gain from that as another fellow human being that AI has never been able to partner and companion with me on. And that recognition of what you're saying, like, how do we understand that these are always going to be the roads that we go down, and knowing like when you have actually traversed too far, can you turn back, right? Like, when can we actually build in these sort of fail-safe mechanisms, if at all? Or if it's just we have that personal responsibility in these spaces. And I do feel really hopeful that the artists are still making the work, and that we do have a huge sector that are participating or staying intentionally outside of these systems, and understanding like, when do I partner, when do I not, when does the data serve, when I need to be in service of my communities. I know we don't have a lot of time, and y'all are like in this space and maybe ruminating and contemplative about all these things. But if there's any like burning questions or inspirations, or you just gotta feel your feet move to the mic to say something, please, yes, contribute.
I have a loud voice. I'm wondering what you feel as though the education plays a role into building trust and innovation. It seems to me like the use of AI is sort of being seen as a replacement for education, and the real danger there is that there is unspoken about bias, and when that happens, there's a lack of awareness, and then that seems to be like what really drives that lack of trust, when you take what AI says and creates at face value. And so I'm really interested in this idea of the Justice AI, and if you feel as though that has created a good response to, here is what the potential bias is in this statement, and if there are other avenues that you think that bias could be acknowledged more in AI that might lead toward a better use of it.
Oof, okay. I just start from the beginning. So I don't necessarily agree with the statement of that AI is replacing education, because you have to have some basic education just to be able to use it, right? And so I think what we're seeing also right now is a demonization of the intellectual, a demonization of learning in general. And then we're talking about a country currently that is in a place with a massive media literacy issue, right? And so AI is only playing to the things that have already been systematically created, that have been there the entire time, right? These problems didn't just pop up now because of AI, they have always been there. So if anything, AI is just showcasing further that these issues exist, right? And then you're allowed to play in it a little bit more with a quicker turnaround value, right? As far as Justice AI, I think he really did the best that he could do for now, right? And that's part of the conversation that Christian is also having, right? I am doing the best that I can with what I have at this moment. And just like Scott was saying, right, we're building the plane in the air. And I think he was really focused on, especially because he does come from an art background, on a lot of the images that AI was generating, right? So I wrote an article for Southwest Contemporary where I spoke with an artist that was using AI, who was using Midjourney to generate images of the typical American. And that was the entire prompt. But every single typical American generated was white, right? And so when Christian started into Justice AI, he was like, why is it that when I ask AI to generate an image for me of an angry woman, she's always black? Right? Why are these things happening? But AI didn't create that bias. AI pulled that bias from Google, because that existed in Google's bias. in its own algorithm, and it was only replicating what it had. So I think we also have to go back to that same conversation. It's only replicating what we already have, right? So if we really want to fix the systemic issues within AI, we have to fix the systemic issues within our culture first, right? No matter how we try to fix these biases, they're always going to come back because they just inherently, intrinsically exist as part of our cultural mapping and dynamic within the colonial structure, right? So I think what Christian is doing is valid and necessary. I don't think he's going to really be able to keep up at the scale that he needs to. And then as we continue to see more division and more implicit bias just being brought out into the frame, AI is picking up all of that too, right? And it's going to kind of just regenerate itself and move into that space. And ultimately, you know, if the foundation is rotten, the building's gonna fall.
I think too, what we have over AI is the power of choice, and we have the power to choose what we retain, what we look at, even now, you know, when you put a search prompt into Google, AI will generate, you know, something for you that seemingly gives you the answer. It's our choice whether or not we just look at that prompt that's like at the top of the website, or whether we go down and actually look at a variety of links to put together the education for ourselves. And so in a lot of ways, it is being really intentional about the information that's in front of you, and whether you choose or not to accept that for being the truth, or being, you know, accurate, or, you know, what you need to hear. And so I think there is a lot to say about the choice that we exercise to how much we let AI educate us.
Yes. We don't have a lot of time, but please.
Hi, how does an artist today protect themselves, especially you've talked about actors, but about musicians and instrumentalists? If you put out something, even if it's just one note or on your particular instrument, well, that's more than one note, but anyway, it can be picked up by others and used. But is there a watermark? We used to go to the copyright office, you know, but what do we do now?
I mean, I know there are some software programs that are supposed to, they don't necessarily watermark, but they kind of confuse the AI programs, and either so that it's either skipped over in the scraping process, or when the platform is prompted for something in the style of so and so, that piece of content that was ingested will kind of confuse it, and it won't draw from that. I have no personal knowledge how effective those programs are, whether they're still available. I know there was one called Nightshade. There was another one called Glaze. And to what extent it works on things other than images, I don't know. But there are countermeasures to AI scraping and usage that software developers have been coming up with since a few years ago, since the first image generators and LLMs came out, and people realized that their content was being used. People have been trying to counter that. I'm sure that will become a cottage industry, even more so as we proceed. So there are some ways, but it's very difficult. It's so easy. Once something is out on the internet, it is so easy to just copy it.
Yeah, two quick answers, and one is idealistic, one is practical. The practical one, I think, is if building a brand. So when you release something, having kind of a moat around you. So on a YouTube channel or on Instagram, there's kind of recognition that it's you, and that helps build a case where if there is concern about pirating or somebody kind of taking your likeness, that then there's a stronger case to be made that there is some reputational effect. The idealistic answer is laid out in a paper I have in Journal of Institutional Economics it's called Governing the Large Language Commons, and it sort of theorizes a new world where every form of content that you put out is like minted on the blockchain, and then then there's some sort of metadata tagging, and this kind of goes to something that we were talking about before the session started, but that's an idealistic version. So I think the practical recommendation is either there's a program like Scott mentioned, or just kind of building a moat around you as best as possible.
All right, room. I want to really honor your time. If some of the panelists can hang out just for a couple minutes. I don't know if we're going to get kicked out of this room, but I feel like we're going to have like a 2.0 next conference just because the technology will be different tomorrow. But thank you so much for your time. Please give a round of applause to these incredible speakers.
Thank you, Chisa.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, I'm taking all the notes. So please, if you've got any questions, and thank you for your generosity of time, spirit, and research, my God, for being in this space. We're so grateful. And happy conferencing, everyone. If you've got questions, please come up.